All right, so welcome everybody to this week's talk in our series with the Banff International Research Station on modeling and theory in population biology. Today we have another event in our series on applications of modeling and theory in problems of societal significance. Marissa Baskett is here from University of California, Davis. And Marissa has done a lot of modeling in ecology and evolution, and especially in the area of marine ecology. And she is going to tell us about models in service of conservation and restoration management, lessons from kelp forest ecosystems.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Noah. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group. I'm really honored, and it's great to have a chance to chat with you all. And I just want to note that I do have the participant and chat windows open to watch for raise hands and questions if any pop up as I go. But to start this off, I define myself as a conservation biologist, conservation scientist, getting more multidisciplinary as I go, which means that by definition, I do use-inspired basic research. Or as Stokes would put it, I sit in Pasteur's quadrant, where there's both quest for fundamental understanding and consideration of use, in this case towards conservation and restoration management in my research. But if we think about these worlds of basic and applied science and them coming together in use and inspired basic research, it presents a challenge to how do you balance these worlds, because they have different core goals and different ways that you conceive and approach the research, right? The core goal of basic science, we're just trying to understand why the world works the way it does. We have natural observations and trying to understand their drivers. And that research is then conceived by scientists with scientists as the primary audience. But there's the thought that, hey, maybe by better understanding the world, we could get to some implications for management. On the flip side, applied science flips the script, right? The questions about what are the management's needs, what are the uses, drive what the research is. And it becomes about understanding the outcomes from different management or policy approaches. And so to do that effectively and well and in a way that it actually gets used, that really relies on careful planning to conceive the research questions in conversation or collaboration with the users, whether they be managers, practitioners, community members. There's all sorts of possible users here, in order to make sure that the research you're doing is relevant to their decision-making process and there's an implementation feasibility within that management and policy context. But while doing that, we're always facing uncertainty with conservation management. And so there's always something to learn. And there are opportunities there to learn about why the world works the way it does. So there also might be basic science insight that comes from applied science. But a question here really is, if there's a different planning process and different driving questions for these, how do we balance these worlds? And so I wanted to use the kelp forest work that has been part of my research throughout my entire research life, and has been a real journey of kind of serendipitous side projects to now something that is really core to what I'm doing right now, to kind of illustrate the back and forth and the balance between these worlds. And so kelp forests, right, are going to be my example today. Kelp form underwater forests that are just the kelp themselves. In California, these kelp can grow 100 to 175 feet tall, whether you're talking about bull kelp or giant kelp as in the picture here. And those form forests the way trees form forests on land. They form a structure and a habitat for a really biodiverse array of systems, and also an array of ways that we interact with and connect to those systems, whether that is just an intrinsic cultural value to these systems or different uses like recreational use and fisheries use of all sorts of types of fisheries, that gets us livelihoods and protein for people. But these kelp forests in these same rocky reef places that you see kelp forests, sometimes you see what we call an urchin barren. So these urchins are grazers on kelp. And normally they're sitting in crevices, subsisting off of just little bits of drift kelp that drift to the floor. But sometimes they'll come up and they form these swarms that can actually attack a kelp holdfast and mow it down and cause kelp mortality. And that can create a switch to these barren urchins. And as the barren word describes, right, you've lost your 3D habitat. So it's a lot lower biodiversity and lower, and then less of all of those associated ecosystem services that derive from that biodiversity. And then when urchins form these barrens, they can actually sit completely empty. You break them up, there's almost nothing inside. So they're dormant and they can sit that way for pretty long periods of time. And so a question then becomes, what's driving the switches between these? And we see these types of switches, not just in California, but worldwide throughout the temperate to more Arctic regions where we do see kelp forest systems. So these switches between a kelp forest system could be representing two possibilities. One is the continuous phase shift world. Some condition shifts, maybe nutrient levels, disturbance levels, something like that. Maybe if it's a long-term shift, we would call it a press perturbation. But if those conditions shift back, you should then recover the original state. Or if you get a short-term pulse disturbance, like a major storm coming in that rips up a bunch of kelp, the recovery should go back to where it came from when that pulse is done. Compare that to the world of, let's say there are alternative stable states, and there's some range for which both of these states are stable under the same conditions. That means as conditions shift, you might stay in one state, but then get, as they shift a little more past this bifurcation point, get a switch to the alternate state. But just stepping back on that press perturbation from where you just were won't necessarily recover the state. You get your hysteresis, your path dependency, where it takes a different journey back to a different point in order to recover the initial state. If we're talking press perturbations, or if we're talking pulse perturbations, a disturbance might cross an unstable threshold. So that under the same background conditions, you could get two possible states depending on where you start. Which gets us to the concept that Holling called ecological resilience, which are base of and of attraction to a particular state. And that starts to become relevant in this world. And so a basic science question is, okay, which is it? And to get to which is it, to get to this world of alternative stable states, you need feedbacks that will maintain each state under each conditions. And so looking at the data, and this is a review paper by Ling et al. That had a lot of different locations where they plotted these data. And location after location, this one happens to be from Tasmania, you see potential signatures of alternative stable states in terms of the bimodality of this, and that you can get kelp or urchin dominance under the same urchin abundance. But then, of course, urchins are a dynamically linked part of this system. These might be representing transients. Models can come into play to say, hey, given the types of interactions that we have, do we expect these alternative stable states? So what are these feedbacks? What are these interactions that could lead to these potential alternative stable states? There is a laundry list, again, reviewed by the Ling et al. Paper. So then models can be really helpful to figuring out, okay, which one of these is more likely potentially to drive these alternative stable states? We can start to bring them into our models and look at that. So that's where this research started out of our group, that really basic science question. What types of feedbacks can drive alternative stable states in kelp forests? You know, models saying what can happen, and then the data says what does happen. And then bringing those models over to the management side for our applied science questions of once we have those feedbacks, how do they affect an array of management decisions? So I am going to go through two different large classes of feedbacks, one around basically structured population interactions and size dependent or stage dependent feedbacks with multi-species harvest being the management and sustainability of that harvest being the management lens. And then the second, getting into grazing behavior feedbacks with restoration being the set of management questions we look into. So to look at that first set of feedbacks and application. you'll notice here that I start off with this idea of recruitment facilitation. So let's just do some marine ecology 101. What am I referring to when I'm talking about recruitment facilitation? So many coastal marine organisms have this classic life cycle where when they release their gametes that fertilize, they enter this what's called planktonic larval stage. Planktonic meaning little or no control over their position in the water column that can disperse for some period of time, but eventually have to come back and settle in order to recruit and become a part of that coastal nearshore population. And so that's what we mean by recruitment, that process from settlement to becoming a part of that coastal population. And so recruitment facilitation is anything that facilitates that recruitment, anything that helps bring those metamorphized larvae into the population. And where my journey on this started was over 15 years ago. I kept on hearing about kelp forest urchin barrens. Those could be alternative stable states. We don't know. And I kept on thinking, well, so then what's the feedback? This was before that really great Lingenall review that listed out all those feedbacks. So what is the feedbacks that could maintain it? And Anne Solomon happened to give a talk where she happened to mention this idea that these little recruits tend to gravitate towards something called crustose coralline algae, this pink encrusting algae. And so that set off, okay, if that algae competes with kelp and kelp can shade out that algae or take over space that prevents that algae, crustose coralline algae, from coming in, then that means that you get more crustose coralline algae, you get more urchin recruits, you get more kelp grazing, you get less kelp, maintains the urchin states, versus if you start off with lots of kelp, less crustose coralline algae, less urchin recruitment, you stay at more kelp. So suddenly, okay, that makes sense. That's a feedback that could logically drive alternative stable states in this system. So I approached Anne, we put together a paper where we showed, hey, if you just have your classic trophic chain, kelp to urchins to some sort of urchin predator, you don't get alternative stable states, right? You only get one possible state under different conditions in terms of, say, herbivore mortality or the amount of predators there. But as soon as you put in this idea that crustose coralline algae and kelp might compete for a limiting resource like space or light, and urchins preferentially recruit to crustose coralline algae, then you do get your possibility for alternative stable states. That's not the only recruitment facilitation going on in this system. Later on, a student in my group, Vadim Karatayev, who is now a postdoc at the University of Kansas and about to start a faculty position at the University of Maryland, he was asking questions about these are really open systems and how does that openness drive affect alternative stable state dynamics. And so he built a model that had the possibility for these top predators to preferentially recruit to kelp because kelp can provide nursery habitat for a number of these urchin predators. Same thing, you put in that recruitment facilitation, you have the possibility of alternative stable states in this system. So what does that potentially mean? So that's a basic science thing, right? What can drive what we see? The potential implications for management here are that the harvest the system can sustain might depend on species interactions. So just taking a single species lens to management might miss some of these thresholds to where you could cross sustainability, not just for that fishery, but for the entire system. So what Zabel et al. Would call ecologically sustainable yield. So potentially saying, considering species interactions could be inform the management decision-making here. And then the recovery, that you get this hysteresis. So if you do get to a place where the system shifts, just moving back to that where you were right before the shift might not lead to recovery. There might have to be a bigger change to get to a recovery path. So this is where Robert Dunn, a student whose primary advisor is Kevin Hovel at San Diego State, part of our joint doctoral program between San Diego State and UC Davis. So I was his Davis advisor. He's now at the University of South Carolina Baruch Institute. So he was doing experiments on predator-urchin interaction and said, well, let's build a model around some of these experiments that consider not just this set of species, but the harvested species as well. So one of the key urchin predators, I have the sheephead here, right, is another one in Southern California are these lobsters. And there's a couple species of urchins going. I've been showing purple urchins. The harvested ones are the red urchins. They live longer, grow bigger, and have been the fishery target. And both of those are harvested in Southern California. So you get to this question of how do you think about multi-species harvesting with these species interactions? And now we can pivot to these applied questions. How do multi-trophic fishing both the predators and the prey, affect this overall ecological resilience of the system if we have this possibility for alternative stable states? And then how do these species interactions then affect rebuilding during closures if you get this possibility for hysteresis in the system? So the rebuilding means that a fishery has been declared overfished, so now you have to come up with a rebuilding plan to get it back to sustainability. So here, Robert put together a model that then started to bring into some of the more nuances of this system, given the applied questions he was looking at and the data that he had to build around, to use in this model. So you have your kelp, classic logistic growth in the kelp, urchins having type 1 functional response, so linear grazing on the kelp that gives them the ability, once they feed, they can get gonads, they can reproduce. We put in recruitment facilitation. Here, the recruitment facilitation, instead of the crestose coralline algae, we did another form of recruitment facilitation is to the urchin spines. The baby urchins can hide in the bigger urchin spines and get protection from predators there. So that also leads to recruitment facilitation. And in particular, it's the larger size classes of urchins that help enable that. We have growth between these different size classes. We have both fishing mortality and natural mortality. We also have predation by the lobsters. And once you put the key reason why we put in these size classes, in addition to the effect on recruitment facilitation, was that these lobsters have a size limit to their predation. They can only eat urchins that fit between their mandibles, and they can flip them over and then eat out the meat. And so that means that bigger urchins can escape lobster predation. And then we also have natural and fishing mortality on the lobsters. So if we put together that model and look at our biomass, here we have on the left-hand plot our kelp, our right-hand plot our lobsters. And we can look up as in the dark lines as we ramp up lobster fishing mortality versus the lighter lines as we ramp it down for different levels of urchin fishing mortality. So now we're looking at the different fishing rates on these two species, right? Looking at them as a multi-species harvest. So as you ramp up fishing, that collapse point is analogous across these dark lines. And so multi-species fishing and the species interactions aren't really mattering to where that threshold is if you start in a sustainable place, if you start with healthy populations, right? But once you've shifted, the ramp back really differs between these lines. Where the lobster recovery is and where the kelp recovery is depends a lot on how much one is harvesting the urchin. And here, actually, harvesting the urchin is beneficial, right? The more you harvest the urchin, the earlier you can start to recover that kelp forest and that lobster system. And so what this is saying is that a small effective urchin harvest and kelp on where that original collapse point masks an overall much larger effect on the overall ecosystem resilience and where those recovery points are. Because what these feedbacks and potential for alternative stable states are really affecting is that possibility of hysteresis and path dependency. But as we were exploring this, one thing we're looking at is really, where do you get the alternative stable states here? Under what parameter space? How relevant could this be really? And under what, in particular, fishing mortality parameter space? So we have lobster fishing mortality on the bottom, urchin fishing mortality going across the y-axis, using an intermediate value for a level of recruitment facilitation. And in the gray, you have your kelp-dominated system, and the white urchin-dominated. In the middle, the black is where you get your alternative stable states. What these three plots are different levels of size-structured predation. And you see, if you ignore the size-structured predation and this possibility for an escape size of the urchins, it's a pretty narrow band where you get alternative stable states. And as you ramp that up, that widens. And this surprised us. We thought the big driver of alternative stable states was going to be all about the recruitment facilitation. it barely makes a blip compared to this size structured predation. And that's, as the urchins get big, they escape predation. They can eat a lot of kelp, maintain your urchin dominated state. If they get small, they're very susceptible predation, right? And then that means that the lobsters can eat a lot of them and maintain your kelp dominated state. So you can see how that creates that same kind of feedback. So here we have the applied side informing the basic science side, giving us an additional mechanism by which these alternative stable states might theoretically be able to occur. So, given all of that effect on recovery, while we were doing this work, Jamil Sampuri was developing a lot of interesting theory on this question of recovery paths and rebuilding plans and how to bring species interactions into those. Because again, much like fishing, traditionally those started out as single species plans, and they're moving more towards taking into account these species interactions and ecosystem-based considerations. So Jamil was looking at these questions. Okay, if you have both predator and prey harvest, you're in a recovery plan with them, what makes the most sense? What's most effective to a fast recovery? First allowing the predator to recover and then the prey, first the prey to recover, then the predator, or try and recover them both at once. And how do these species interactions affect that? So Robert then led a paper with us to ask then to bring that theory to this question of this lobster urchin kelp series of interactions. So the idea behind these plans, you start from an unharvested equilibrium, then you run to an harvest equilibrium to a point where some manager says, we got to start a recovery plan. So you initiate recovery in different ways, synchronous or potentially sequential, where you might do one species and then another species. And in each of these, what we calculate is the volatility, how much variability you get on the path to that recovery, as well as the length of the transients. So what's your overall recovery time or return time? And the goal is to get both of these down, right? Faster return times with lower volatility in the management context. So here we have our two metrics, return time and volatility on these two plots. With different recovery plans. The light one, the synchronous, the middle one, the predator first, the darker one, the prey first, with different starting points for the three different sets of bars. And you can see these middle ones, the predator first, tend to do the best, lead to the fastest return time and lowest volatility. And that's a shift from, in this system compared to the original, just simple predator-prey systems that Jamil was looking at. But the interesting thing here is much bigger than which plan you pick is where you start, right? That starting in a kelp-dominated state gets you to faster recovery with lower volatility than starting in urchin-dominated state, and starting somewhere in the middle puts you somewhere in the middle. And again, looking at this effect of this size-dependent predation. If you take away the size-dependent predation, this difference between approaches goes away, right? With no size-dependent predation, these bars are just all looking the same. With the stronger size-dependent predation, that's where you start to get a difference in the efficacy of these different recovery mechanics. So to pull all of that together, we planned for one mechanism and ended up with two mechanisms that can drive the potential for alternative stable states, recruitment facilitation at multiple points, and size-dependent predation, which we actually found was the stronger of the effects. And then from these models that are telling us when you can get alternative stable states, we can use them in a management context to say, that these decisions depend on these feedbacks, and that includes affecting management decisions of what lobster harvest level recovers a system and what sequence of closures lead to a faster and less volatile recovery. And so really these feedbacks, less affecting where that sustainable fishing original threshold is if you start in a pristine state, affecting much more recovery dynamics because of their effects on the overall resiliency of the system. So that is our first set. Now we're going to do a pivot to a different set of feedbacks and a different set of management applications. So again, this is work that was led by Vadim Karataya when he was a PhD student in our group. And Vadim started out, I alluded to, he had a really great chapter on how openness of these systems affects how alternative stable states play out. And he was using a lot of data from the Channel Islands in Southern California for that. Then he had the opportunity to spend some time in New Zealand and work on data from there. And he happened to notice that you have very different spatial patterns of these kelp forest urchin barren systems across these two locations. In California, the kelp forests occurred irrespective, and urchin barrens were irrespective of depth. You didn't really see a depth effect here. It was more patchy along the coast. New Zealand, on the other hand, had a strong depth effect. You had the urchin barrens more inland, the kelp forests more offshore, and with a patchy transition. So the patchiness was at these intermediate depths at all locations across the coast. So you didn't have these patches along the coast, they were along depths instead, and started wondering, again, classic basis science, we see something. Why? Why is that happening? Why do we get these different spatial patterns? And so Vadim hypothesized that it has to do with the urchin shift in its grazing behavior. So urchins, like I mentioned earlier, have these two grazing modes. They can either sit and hide in crevices and live off of the drift kelp that's raining down on them and be perfectly fine on that, or they come out and swarm a kelp and actually consume its holdfast and start going up and down the kelp, and that's what actually causes kelp mortality. So what causes a shift in these behavioral modes? There are lots of possibilities. One is just having enough drift kelp to satiate them. Another is fear of predators, makes them hide in crevices. So that if there are lots of predators around, maybe they hide. Another is that the kelp itself might actually as it moves around in the water, cause whiplash and be a deterrent to the urchins getting up and moving around. And so Vadim hypothesized that in Southern California, with these giant kelp, you have lots of drift kelp production, and it can spread over large regions. And so it's a regional scale feedback, and that's leading to that drift satiation where the urchins stick in their crevices. Whereas in New Zealand, you have much shorter kelp, because it's a different kelp species. And those kelp do the whiplash thing, right? The giant kelp are just too tall to have that effect on the seafloor. But the New Zealand kelp are shorter. And maybe there's also that predator harboring effect. And so that's going to be a much more localized feedback. That feedback that causes the shift in urchin grazing behavior mode is going to occur just at the edges between the urchin barren and the kelp forest, rather than across a whole region that where currents might move to drift kelp. So he put together a model looking at these feedbacks that affected your urchin grazing rate as it depended on kelp density. So without a feedback, you just get your mowing down type 1 functional response, linear grazing, increased urchin grazing with increased kelp. But once you have these feedbacks at high kelp densities, it means the urchins aren't direct grazing kelp, right? They're not causing kelp mortality because they're living in crevices off of the drift kelp. And so at high kelp densities, urchin grazing rate actually goes down. So you get a unimodal or a type 4 functional response, if we're going to use the Halling functional response language, with a peak at some intermediate kelp density to the amount of urchin grazing. But then what kelp density do you look at? Do you look at just the local kelp density, or do you look at a larger spatial scale in the regional kelp density to say what kelp density matters to the urchin grazing rate? So Vadim put together a model where you could either turn on or off this feedback, with the feedback, either make the feedback dependent on kelp densities locally or regionally to say which one of these models best fit the data that we have for each region. Also putting in those environmental drivers, because anytime we're talking about spatial patterns, we have to ask, well, how much of it is just environmental? Environmental change there's some abiotic environmental effect here. And so using each of these on versus off, looked at the best fit model to the data with Bayesian information criteria, and found that the best fit model in California has that regional kelp density feedback to urchin behavior, right? That helps reproduce. Here you see kelp density going from low in the yellow or low in blue to high in yellow, and depth along our Y, urchin density along our X. So here you can see both in the observation and models for California, depth doesn't matter. The y-axis doesn't matter to these patterns, right? And that your urchin density, or visible urchin density, I should say, determines whether you are in a world of forest only, alternative stable states, or barrens only, right? Versus New Zealand, suddenly you get this depth effect to your kelp density, and where you get the inshore urchin barrens and the offshore kelp forests. So you need both the local feedback and the effect of depth and its associated environmental drivers to reproduce this outcome in New Zealand. So that tells us, yes, these grazing behavior switches can potentially drive alternative stable states in this system, and that they might act differently in different regions and produce different spatial patterns. While Vadim was working with these data in Southern California, Northern California was going through an interesting and surprising unexpected series of events. And so in Northern California, we have the bull kelp, a different kelp species that forms the dominant kelp forests. In 2013, there was an outbreak of sea star wasting disease. Now in Northern California, I showed you these sheephead and lobster predators on urchins. You probably all, when you think urchin predators, think sea otters. Those aren't in Northern California, right? The main urchin predator was these Pycnopodia sea stars, these large sunflower subtidal sea stars. And they went functionally extinct because of this sea star wasting disease. For years, we didn't observe any. In the past few years, we've observed just a few. Following the disease outbreak was a series of warm water events, thanks in part to this warm blob that you can see pictured here. Warm water means low levels of nutrients, which really is detrimental to kelp and especially kelp growth. It might have exacerbated the disease. There's a lot of questions around the disease dynamics for the sea stars. So all of that meant over a 90% decline of bull kelp forests on California North Coast. I mean, imagine if we had a 90% loss of redwood forests in California. This is essentially the underwater equivalent of that happening. At the same time, visible urchins not hiding in crevices where we can't see them, but actually visible, increased 60-fold. So this is very much a system-wide state switch to urchin barrens with small remnant patches of kelp left. Unlike urchins, abalone can't go dormant. They can't go empty and persist for long periods of time. If they don't have kelp, drift kelp in particular, falling to the floor, they starve. And that's what happened to the red abalone off of the California North Coast. We had mass abalone die-offs, and so the recreational abalone fishery had to close entirely. And this was a big part of the North Coast economy. People coming up to do their abalone diving, and that supporting dive shops and all of the associated tourism industry on the North Coast. Another important part of the North Coast economy and livelihoods was the red sea urchin fishery. And the red sea urchins, like the purples, can go dormant, but when they're dormant, they are empty. They do not have the gonads inside that are uni, what we eat as sushi. And so they have no value to the fishery. So fishery landings are what declined by 80%, not red urchins, but the landings of the red urchins. And it was declared a federal fishery disaster in 2019. So in response to this and all the community needs and community concerns raised, a number of community groups, NGOs, and state and federal agencies like California Department of Fish and Wildlife and Ocean Protection Council and Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary are all working together on restoration. That originally started out focused on employing the red urchin divers to do urchin removal, purple urchin removal, especially around these last remnants of kelp, these kelp oases, and in regions of economic importance to the community. More recently, new techniques have been developed by Scott Hamilton and Mike Graham and Brent Hughes and others to be able to actually outplant kelp, live kelp, and supplement the kelp population that way. And so then, but we know as these restoration activities are going on, there are going to be future marine heat waves. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the sea star wasting disease and any potential, what's going to happen with that. So future disturbances are coming to this system. So a question is then how to engage in these restoration practices with future disturbance in mind and climate change in mind. And so that's where Jorge Arroyo Esquivel's work comes in. So this is his work when he was a PhD student here in Alan Hastings' lab and worked with me on some of these models. He currently has a position at Cal Fish and Wildlife. And so he said, okay, Vadim developed this amazing model. Let's take these kelp urchin grazing feedbacks, bring this into the system and say, well, then how does it affect some of these decisions? Where your urchin removal is, what level allows kelp recovery, and how you might supplement that with either kelp reseeding or kelp outplanting, planting out more established kelp, and compare those separately and in combination. When do you get a gain for doing them together? And an initial versus ongoing intervention. So Jorge's model has kelp urchin interactions where the kelp have their recruitment using a Beverton-Holt, saturating density-dependent recruitment there. So there's some space limitation essentially. Urchins direct graze on recruits, can direct graze on kelp, but have that type 4 functional response that Vadim showed is a best fit for at least the giant kelp in California. So we hypothesized that it could work for the bull kelp as well. And have that drift kelp as well be a part of how urchins get food and are able to reproduce and produce new recruits. We put this in space because what we're interested in is this question of spread rate. How do you get the fastest spread rate of kelp spreading out into urchin barrens to get that kelp recovery? And so we have our dispersal there, and then the urchins have either natural mortality or removal happening. So question 1 is, well, then where is your, as you plant out more kelp, from no planting starting here all the way up on our x-axis, how many urchins do you need to remove essentially to cross that threshold to get to the kelp forest to a point where it's going to start to spread? So the threshold urchin density for kelp recovery is the y-axis. So as you move down, that means you're removing more on this y-axis. And what you can see is that, yeah, as you plant out more kelp, that means you have to spend less effort on removing urchins and vice versa. So each of these helps complement the other. We were a little surprised at how linear it was. There's no super additive or synergistic effects here, but they can each benefit the other. But a key insight here is these 3 lines are the different levels of kelp, that peak of that type 4 functional response, where urchin grazing behavior shifts from direct grazing to hiding in their crevices and living off of drift kelp. That where these thresholds are really depend on, and where, how far you need to go with management depend a lot on where that peak is. We have very little idea of that parameter value. And a global sensitivity analysis pulled this out as one of the most sensitive parameters. And so this can also point to what do we need to measure to be able to have more quantitatively informed management targets. And then that initial versus ongoing question. So here you have, you're assuming a certain, across these plots, different initial amount of kelp. And then along the Y, you say, okay, well then what do we do ongoing? Once you've done your initial effort of urchin removal, kelp outplanting, what about continuing one or the other of those efforts? Which one of those best enhances that spread rate of kelp? And so it depends a bit on how much kelp you start with. And over these, we found kelp reseeding was the most beneficial ongoing intensity. But as we were doing this, those who were actually developing the methods for this found that putting out kelp seed bags and spore bags in the California North Coast with really intensive currents and waves was just not effective. They got washed out. And so this gets to, you got to consider feasibility as you build these models as well. And so there was new information about feasibility that came out as we were publishing this, essentially. So considering, so that, says, okay, those are the tools that are currently in the toolkit: urchin removal, kelp outplanting. And they can potentially, theoretically, lead to recovery of kelp forests. But then we have this issue of future marine heat waves, and that we have still functionally lost this main predator, the Pycnopodia sea stars. So once you recover them, how do you keep them? What leads to their resiliency to these future disturbances? And I put resiliency in quotes because we're going to get very specific by what we mean by that in a quantitative sense. And if we can get to kelp forests recovered without sea stars, does it matter? Do sea stars matter to that future resiliency, as well as do all of these different feedbacks we've been talking about matter to that future resiliency? So again, Jorge led this project, putting together a model of kelp urchin grazing on both live and drift kelp and sea stars consuming urchins with a few different feedbacks. There's what we've been talking about, that drift kelp feedback. If there's more drift kelp, urchins switch their grazing behavior. They prefer the drift. They're going to graze less on the live kelp. If there are sea stars around, that induces a fear response in the urchins. And so again, they're not going to graze on the live kelp. They're going to hide in their crevices and graze on and live off of the drift. Another feedback we looked into was urchin condition. That if urchins are well fed and have lots of gonads, that changes their condition and how predators might respond to them. The original thought was that the predators would prefer the well-fed urchins. And that is true for sea otters. But remember, we don't have sea otters on the California North Coast. That they are picky eaters, and and Josh Smith has showed they will preferentially eat urchins, if they have a choice, urchins that have been eating a lot of kelp and are full, versus over empty urchins, barren urchins. But when Jason Hoden, one of our co-authors on this, was doing experiments with sea stars and sea star urchin interactions, he found that the barren urchins were actually more susceptible to sea star predation, and sea stars didn't show a preference. Because if you think about it, barren urchins are in poor condition. They're starved, and so that makes them more susceptible to predation in this system. So that gives us our model. Then how do we measure resilience? So using our classic ball and cup diagram to represent these two possible states, a kelp-dominated state versus an urchin-dominated state, we have three metrics of resilience. One is recovery rate. If you get disturbed but you stay in the same cup, how quickly do you return to your target state? In this case, kelp-dominated. And we can get that by linearizing the system around the kelp-dominated equilibrium and finding the leading eigenvalue, right? That's your local return rate. We have recovery likelihood, which we can get the basin of attraction to your target state. We can get to that to the proportion of initial conditions that lead to this state. But then the last piece is, how high is this hill? And that's the resistance. Where Jorge used quasi-potential analysis, an approach that came out of Karen Abbott's group, to say, okay, what's the resistance? How big of a disturbance do you need before you flip to another state? And so across all of the parameters, we did a global sensitivity analysis. So that means you're randomly drawing from a range for all parameters at once and doing a series of regression trees to figure out and rank which one of these parameters most drives the outcome. So we have our three metrics: recovery likelihood, recovery rate, resistance, on these three plots. We tried to color code by different kelp-related, urchin-related, and sea star-related parameters, but a lot of these are interaction parameters, right? And so what we find is different parameters are differentially important to each of these resilience metrics. So that's a basic science insight, right? What you call, what most matters to resilience varies depending on how you measure resilience. And so drift kelp production was most important to that recovery likelihood, that basin of attraction to the kelp-dominated state. So if you can produce more drift from the same amount of change, you're more likely to recover your, keep your urchins in that cryptic behavior and recover your kelp-dominated state. Recovery rate depended on basically urchin turnover rates. Determining the overall rate of how quickly the urchins could grow in this system and the recovery rate to the kelp-dominated state. And so it's affecting, how quickly urchins might grow or decline in response to kelp there. But then so none of those involve sea stars, right? Where sea stars came in is that urchin condition effect on sea star predation is what most affected the resistance, was our top ranked parameter in this global sensitivity analysis for our resistance metric. And so how big of a future of a disturbance might cause you to flip these states. And so that means we need a holistic look at measuring resilience in order to understand the potential role of sea star recovery or sea star reintroduction, which is a brand new idea still in development with a lot of questions around it. But to understand that role, right, you need this holistic look at resilience, and that again gets to this idea that it might be feasible with the tools at hand to recover a kelp forest, but the question of whether it can maintain under these future disturbances depends potentially on the sea stars being around. So part 2 conclusions, that we have another set of interactions and feedbacks that can potentially drive alternative stable states in this system. But now we can start to look at the spatial patterning of the data to determine which of these feedbacks is most relevant to a particular system, through Vadim's model fitting approaches. And then Jorge's use of those models in application says when you account for these feedbacks, that can influence a lot of management decisions, like your threshold, urchin removal, or kelp outplanting approaches, and the potential role of sea stars in the recovery or reintroduction in the future resistance of these systems to ongoing climate change. We are not done. This keeps growing. Something that came out of a random me hearing Anne give a talk and saying, oh, that would be a fun model to build, let's put that together, has suddenly become the core of what we do. And so in our group, and restoration is a big ongoing questions in these systems. When I started in this world, the idea of loss on the level that we have seen on the California North Coast is not anything anybody would have expected. And so there still are a lot of important questions and management relevant questions growing around restoration. And we are working right now as part of a large multidisciplinary team to expand our viewpoint of what we mean by restoration, right? So far, I've been talking about everything within the ecological system. But this is a coupled human natural or social environmental system. And we can think about drivers of resiliency, not just in the ecological system, but on the human side as well, and emerging from those interconnections. So that is where our group, in collaboration with a number of others, is focused right now. And we're really excited about some of that work. It's very much new and ongoing. And again, we're looking to partner with a number of agencies that could potentially be using this information, like Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Ocean Protection Council, trying to maintain our conversations with them to make sure that as we develop this, it is relevant to their needs. So putting all of these pieces together, partly by accident, over 15 years, our group has looked at a lot of these feedback mechanisms to say, yeah, of this laundry list, a lot of them can drive potential alternative stable states in the system. In fact, we've even added to the list with some of our work. But more than just giving a long list that can say, okay, so which one of these actually does, these models can be really useful to say which one is strongest when you put them together, right? Of the recruitment facilitation and the size structured predation. To our surprise, the size structured predation was the stronger one. And like Vadim's work showed, they can lead to different spatial patterns. So that lets you differentiate which ones might be at play in one location versus another. So it can also help us navigate this list to understand which is most relevant to a particular, might be, again, models say what can happen, data says what does happen, might be relevant to a particular system. And then as we answer these basic science questions of why we see these patterns we do, these give us foundational model frameworks to inform a lot of different potential management decisions, ranging from fisheries rebuilding to kelp forest system restoration. And so in thinking about how we bridge these worlds, some of this is just capitalizing on serendipity, right? We happen to be developing these models for one use, for basic science, and had some implications for management. And they gave us frameworks that when surprises happened, like the California North Coast change, we had the framework ready to go for an application. And that is serendipity, right? But then once you have that framework, that's when you do that careful planning. Once you're doing that pivot to the applied science, that's when we start talking to the end users and making sure that as we bring those frameworks and ask the applied questions with them, that is going to be relevant to their use. So if there's a major lesson here, there's this balance between the flexibility and the serendipity and letting things emerge, but also having careful planning when you're talking about use and just figuring out where you're sitting on this spectrum. It's not an either or, but it's a range of basic applied science and when that engagement comes into play. And if there's a lesson learned from me, it's that, you know, as the unexpected happened, that having these models developed and ready and being able to be useful has just been very rewarding to be able to say, hey, this thing that we developed for one reason is actually useful here, and be able to bring this modeling work into inform science-based conservation. So I want to thank especially the student leaders that led all of this work, but all of the amazing co-authors on this work, the funding sources, and hopefully we have time for questions.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Marissa. Really a lot of great stuff in your talk, and also very much appreciate the high level thinking about basic and applied science, which is kind of a big part of what we're trying to do in this whole program is understand the role of fundamental work on theory and models, and how it connects to applied problems and what those feedbacks look like. So while we're waiting for anyone who has a question to put those in the chat, let me ask you about economics. Whether that's kind of part of the thinking, because I kind of see that in all these scenarios, you have a trophic interaction that has multiple economically valuable species, and I'm wondering if the management decision is taking into account things like changes in the price or interests of the different species, or maybe with the abalone, like something about the seasonality and kind of how important those are, and whether there's some role for having that explicitly incorporated into the model, or whether that's sort of only something that comes down the road.
Absolutely. So yes, I mentioned that we've got this big multidisciplinary team. That includes Mike Springborn, who's a faculty in environmental economics here in our department, and his student, Cumin Kim. And so part of the idea behind this project is that we have partners on the ecological data side to say, what are the natural drivers of resiliency? Why do we see those remnant kelp patches where we see them? Characterize the social system. What are the ways in which people are connected to the community, and what are their goals? Right? It's the role of science is to say how to best achieve a given goal. Society determines what the goal is. And then we pull that together and with the bioeconomic modeling, we can get to what's the economically optimal approach to achieve a given goal, given various costs and benefits of these different restoration practices. And especially what Mike's group does a lot of is decision-making under uncertainty. How do we take into account the uncertainty of future climate scenarios when navigating some of these economic decisions about restoration intervention? So he and Cumin are building some really great models around that. So that gets us to optimal approach. But then can you achieve the optimal? So that brings in our other set of social scientists, Tyler Scott and his student Gabby Yang, who are doing the social network analysis to say, well, then what are the barriers to achieving the optimal? And getting to then how do we lower those barriers? And that's what gets to this idea of a more nimble response in the future. So 100% economics come into play here. You're right, they come into play in that lobster, the Southern California lobster urchin fishery as well, and collaborating with environmental economics on these really opens up a lot of the questions that you can answer. But I would say the social science of this does not stop at economics. It also includes a lot of that more social network and policy questions as well. And there's a lot of exciting opportunity at the interface of all of these together.
Great. Okay, so a question here from Daniel. Daniel, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hello. Sure. My question was like in the example in Northern California where the sea stars had a certain disease, I'm trying to sort of explore management strategies on how to kind of stop this alternative urchin-dominated stable state from just taking over. Were like maybe more potentially drastic management options like reintroducing sea otters or certain like large predators to kind of replace the work of these sea stars also considered or are being considered?
So it's a very tricky question that again comes into what are the goals of the local community as well as feasibility. On one hand, there's a question of, because the sea otters have been naturally expanding during their recovery, and they just basically stopped before this North Coast region I'm talking about. And when you look, Tim Tinker's done some really great analysis on this. When you look at why you see sea otter mortality anywhere north of that stop point, it's great white sharks, shark bites. And so it might just be that naturally this is a region of either potentially lower sea otter density because of who's there and what's in this system. So that raises a feasibility question. And there's a very long-term question of what was the history of this system, and especially before colonialization, which raises a lot of questions. And so, but then the flip side is on the community. What are the goals? Sea otters are voracious predators on all of these things, and that includes the red urchins. It includes the red abalone. And so there's a question if sea otters are reintroduced, you might not then be able to recover, you might get recovery of red abalone and red urchins being gathered again, but will you be able to actually have a fishery with them is an open question. And so this also gets into the societal goals and just what are the stakeholder goals? Right? Different members of the community are going to have very different views and I definitely voice those views about, that whether or not sea otter introduction is relevant here. And so there has been what's called the Sea Otter Summit. There have been stakeholder group organization around asking this question. But I have otters here because we're doing a Central Coast, North Coast comparison. And on the California Central Coast, in the Monterey Bay area, there are sea otters And in Monterey, they have the giant kelp rather than the bull kelp. They had about 50% loss of kelp instead of the over 90% loss of kelp we had on the California North Coast. And there's potentially two reasons for that. One is they had a backup predator in the sea otters. So when they lost the sea stars, there's still something eating the urchins. And the other is the giant kelp are a perennial and the bull kelp are an annual. And so you have a very different kelp life history there too. And so, yeah, sea otters could potentially be playing a role in this overall system resilience, but you also got to consider the societal context and the local community goals when considering that. And so it's in discussion amongst some people, but it's a very controversial question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just I mean it's the time of year here at Stanford where occasionally you kind of see a herd of goats eating the grass to kind of keep the vegetation down before the fire season, and kind of that same idea of could you bring something in came to mind, so that's great. So yeah, maybe just one last question here. So, and because we're right at 10 o'clock. Uh, you know, I guess in these systems, um, you know, you've used a lot of like the very particular behavior of the. Oh, okay. Actually, okay. Got somebody else in the chat. So let's. I'll read Reggie's question here. Was the pathogen for the sea star wasting disease ever isolated? Did it spread with the warm currents? There was a similar mass die-off of sponges starting the Bahamas and spreading with a warm current throughout Gulf Coast, Central America about 100 years ago that killed 90% of sponges. No one knows if it was a fungus or something else.
Then this is true of a lot of marine diseases, and Drew Harvell and others have done some work bringing that together, that for many marine diseases, we don't know the pathogen. Sea star wasting disease, the original thought, as I understand it, was that it was a bacteria. The current thinking is shifting more towards it's likely a virus, but they still haven't isolated the pathogen itself. There's also layered onto that. So did it spread with warm currents? So the disease started again a year before the warm blob and marine heat wave. I believe it was pretty widespread by then. I'd have to look at the data to be sure. And the question of warm waters there is whether or not they might have increased the severity of the disease. Rather than the presence of the disease. And there's a lot of ongoing work to try and figure that out. That I would say is still a question under investigation, just like the agent, the pathogen is a question under investigation. Another question under investigation is, you saw different sea star species being differentially hit, right? The Pycnopodia sunflower stars, very hard hit. Same for that 5-armed Pisaster sea star that when you picture a sea star in the California intertidal is probably what you're picturing. As well as they got really hard hit, but they recovered really well. And the Pycnos haven't, but they have very different, is it the slower life history? Why? What's going on there? And then the bat stars didn't get hit as hard. They still got some declines, but not as much as the other species. So there's variation among sea stars. People have been looking, hey, have we seen any evidence of resistance coming out to resistance to this disease? There's no evidence yet, but again, it's a difficult thing to investigate. So huge numbers of questions around the sea star wasting disease is such a new development here on the California coast. And there's a lot to learn.
Thank you. So we're after the hour, so I'd like to thank Marissa again for really a terrific talk, and like to remind everybody that next week we will have a recorded interview conducted by Sally Otto and John Wakely with Deborah Charlesworth, and that will go live on Wednesday of next week. So thank you all again for coming, and thanks again to Marissa for a terrific talk. and see you next week.